Hi everyone! We're here with another book chat. We are choosing categories from our excellent Summer Reading Club Spaceopoly game, and each of us are going to talk about a book. And today our topic is Canadian authors! Yay! There's a reason I'm the only one on screen right now. Yay! I'm so excited. So, for me, the great thing about Canadian authors is that Canadian books give a sense of connection to place and people. I don't mind can lit. I really like Robertson Davies. I tolerate Margaret Atwood. But I really like
here.
but what I really like is books set in places that I recognize with people I feel like I could meet. It's also really exciting to support local publishers and authors. But within our little group, there are some mixed feelings about Canadian authors. I think everyone has been able to find a book they're excited to talk about. So I will bring everyone up here, see if they agree. Have we all found something we're excited to talk about?
Yes.
Yes, Fiona.
All right. I think Liz is going to be going first. So Liz, what did you pick today?
Well, today I have for everybody a book called Lost Feast, and it is by not only a Canadian author, but an author who lives locally within BC. Her name is Lenore Newman. Now, the subtitle of this book is Culinary Extinction and the Future of Food. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this Canadian author-written book was that she also provided a local perspective. Granville Island, for example, and also farms in the Fraser Valley come up. I also appreciate that the book wasn't a very America or United States-centric book talking about our food that we eat here in BC and in Canada. So it was nice to have that balance. So a big win for reading Canadian authors who write nonfiction books. So Lost Feast talks about the history of food on a global scale. It talks about its consumption and how that has evolved over time as people and societies and industrialization has evolved. And also the effects of that industrialization, the expansion of transportation in global markets, and how that has affected our diet and environment, and how those go hand in hand. What's really great about this book is that Lenore Newman actually visits sites where they farm food or produce food. She talks to scientists as well as farmers and people who are experts in the industry. It's been really fascinating to read about where a lot of the food that we consume here in Canada comes from, and also not just on a sort of 100-mile scale or how did it get to our supermarket, but how over time certain varieties of foods, including plants as well as animals, have come from other parts of the world to our plates here in Canada. Unfortunately, though, a lot of the foods that we do have are being eaten out of existence. And there are a lot of foods that are already gone from our tables and no longer available. Because of what humans have done in terms of farming and transportation and industrialization of food manufacturing and consumption, it's led to a lack of genetic diversity as well as biodiversity. And that in turn can be very perilous for us in terms of our nutrition and the access to food to feed everybody within the world. Because a lack of diversity means that these foods are more prone to extinction, either through extinction through climate change or through disease, pestilence, that sort of thing. So don't get too hung up on any food particular food item because it could very well be off of your plate sometime in the future. An example of lack of diversity is some of the fruit we have. So for the varieties of pears and apples that we say get from the Okanagan or from Washington State, they used to number in the absolute hundreds, and that has been whittled away to only a small amount of varieties. Bananas, they essentially are all derived from one genetic enhanced variety, so to grow under optimal conditions in many parts of the world. Also, passenger pigeons. Those used to number in the billions, and because they became such a cheap and plentiful delicacy for people over time, the last passenger pigeon actually left this earth in 1914. So we went from billions and billions of pigeons to just the one. I think her name was Martha. She lived at the Cincinnati Zoo. And sadly, she's no longer here, and neither are the passenger pigeons. So that's one extreme example of the culinary extinction that humans have caused. But there is hope. Newman does talk about how we are developing more robust varieties of food. We're eating more locally, more farm to table. And we're also looking at lab created food. So foods that don't use as much water and soil and environmental factors to produce. So anyways, I really enjoyed this book. I really like reading nonfiction. So if you're interested in where your food comes from, what types of food maybe we are not able to indulge in anymore, and also to read about it from a Canadian perspective, then I definitely do recommend Lost Feast by Lenore Newman.
Thanks, Liz. That sounds so interesting.
Poor Martha the pigeon.
Yes. Rest in peace, Martha.
Rest in peace.
I grew some radishes in my garden, and it's the first time I've ever done anything like that, and did it right from seed. And they grew, and they were black and like weird. We were like, what are these? This is not a radish. And it turned out it was just a different kind of radish. It was a black Spanish radish, which is black and more like turnip-like, but just blew my mind. It's like, oh yes, all radishes do not look the same.
That's awesome. Green thumb here.
All right, Karine, you are next. What do you have for us?
Yeah, I'm going to take a sharp detour away from that bummer of a book, Liz. Sorry. Yeah, it's summer. It's time for like fun reads in my heart and in my house. So I chose a debut novel that is fun, frothy. It is perfect for just like setting aside for the weekend, and you'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll fall in love. I chose Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin. It is her first novel, which is baffling because it is so fantastically good. It is kind of like a revisit of Pride and Prejudice. And as a P&P Jane Austen for Life fan, I have read a lot of retellings, and they're usually like bad. They're not fun to read because they're like a little bit too obvious, but I just love the spin that the author takes on this particular tale. So in your cast as Mr. Darcy, is it's all set within the Muslim community in Eastern Toronto. So very local, very good sense of place. Woo-hoo. And our Mr. Darcy, yeah, right. Our Mr. Darcy is a very traditional religious practicing man who dresses in a certain way that reflects his faith. So he wears a kufi, like a skull cap. He has a longer beard, so he's very like visibly Muslim and a little bit more traditional. He lives with his mother. He plans to have an arranged marriage because that's for him is kind of like how he wants to live his life. On the other side, and actually on the other side of the street, you have Aisha, who is also a practicing Muslim. She wears the hijab. She loves going to mosque. She's very involved with her community there, but she is at her heart an artist. She is a spoken word poet, but like so many of us, she kind of has to set her dreams aside and pay them bills. So she is a substitute high school teacher, but her heart is kind of ground down by that. And she really wants to kind of like go and explore her dreams. So obviously these two meet, they clash. She thinks that he has certain ideas about her. He thinks that she has certain ideas about him. There is misunderstandings galore. There is big characters. Aisha's family is full of like these giant big personalities that are always getting into trouble. There's a little bit of a mystery at the mosque happening. And as Sheldon says in The Big Bang Theory, Pride and Prejudice itself is a flawless masterpiece. He's got too much pride. She's got too much prejudice. It just works. And that is exactly what happens in Aisha Last. It is the perfect summer read. And I believe it has been optioned to make a film. And I can see why. Like, you are just going, it's just a ride, a fun, amazing ride. So strongly recommend if you enjoyed last summer's Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavors or Unmarriageable and just want like another like more Toronto spin on it.
And don't we all just want more Toronto spin-offs of everything?
They are the center of the world after all.
Okay.
Certainly the center of Canada. Anyway, if you're just joining us now, we are talking about Canadian authors today. So books by Canadian authors. And I believe, Virginia, you're up next.
All right. Well, Canadian authors don't always have to write books that is set in Canada. They could also write other books because they have many, many talents. And so the book that I've got, which is...
Not me, Virginia.
No, I know. It's like...
I'm trying. Can you help me?
What is happening? Oh, here we are. Hello, everyone.
Technical difficulties.
So the book that I've got is called The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. So this is also a debut novel, and it is amazing. And if you're playing Spaceopoly with us this summer, this book will also fit into the category of a book by a Black author, a book one in a series, Shuttle to Africa, a book that is inspired or set in Africa, and of course also a Canadian author. So many, many bonus points here for this book. So the book here is about Rage of Dragons, as you can tell from the title, is a fantasy novel, and it is inspired, in African-inspired fantasy novel, which is very, very refreshing. And when I say fantasy novel, this is an epic fantasy and is epic in every sense of the word because it is just epic and amazing. The publisher actually marketed this book as the Game of Thrones meets The Gladiator. And as you can tell from the title, dragons are involved. But unlike the Game of Thrones, you don't ride dragons. You mind control these dragons. And only by a very few selected, gifted female mages that are able to draw power from a source. I'm not going to spoil what the source is, but amazing, like that whole magic system. But they can draw the source from power from this source, and they can mind control the dragon. They can also feed the power to these special warriors who could then turn themselves into these giant, invisible superhumans, because the Omahi people has been fighting a war for like ever and ever. That's what they do. They are just a very war-torn place, and so they're just always fighting for their place. And in this world where Evan Winter has developed for us, it's also very caste-based. So you got the nobles who like get everything, they rule over everybody, they have special powers, they're the one who can turn into these special giant warriors. And then you got the commoners, the lessers, who also have to learn how to fight. But they're going to be like the red shirts. They're the ones who are going to go into war and going to go first into battle and die first, because they are just extras in this society. So Tao is our main character, and Tao is know that he's a commoner. He knows that that's going to be his fate. He's just going to go into battle and die, and you want to avoid it. So he figured, well, you know what? Maybe I can just pretend to be injured, and then I can just stay home because I can't go into battle, and I can marry my sweetheart, and then I can just stay alive, basically. But of course, things are going to happen to him that is going to, like destroy his plan, and some of the nobles have done something to his family, and as a result, from then on, all he could think of is revenge. He's going to train himself to be the best swordsman ever. He's going to get really, really good by all means necessary to become the best of the best, so he can climb up that ladder. Even though he's a commoner, he's going to climb up that ladder to get to the free nobles that are responsible for the wrongdoing to his family. And so he's just consumed by vengeance. And you watch him kind of grow, make very terrible choices. But that's kind of what I like about the character, because it's not like just he's not all good, like he make bad decisions, but you're rooting for him. You're like, trying to, hoping that he will get what he wants, and of course then the rest of the world is also against him in many ways. There's a lot of like political stuff going on, so he's going to get sucked into all of that, whether he likes it or not. If you like fantasy, if you like sort of a Stormlight Archive, and you're like just can't wait for the 4th book to come out this November, I think this would be a good one for you. The trajectory of how Tao develops is very similar to like Kaladin in my mind, and the writing I find too is just like, it's so like good. It's so fast paced. Things happen in the book, which is what I like in a fantasy, and there's always things happening. The action scenes, the battle scenes, the fight scenes are amazing, and the dragons are like, I don't really care for dragons, but the dragons here, like, the way why they can be mind controlled, like, it's actually an important part of the plot, and super interesting. Like I said, super interesting magic system. Everything about this book is just everything I want in an epic fantasy novel. So if you like that, highly recommend it. So Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. Go read it. Oh, and there's a book 2 coming out. Book 2 coming out also in November. Can't wait to get back into this world. Yeah, whatever, Corinne. I see your face.
That kind of like sounds good. Actually, sounds okay. That was like a
Sure. It's really, really good fantasy. Really good.
She might give it a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
I was muted.
It happens.
It's good. Gives other people a chance to talk. All right. Sadie, you are up.
All right. So I am going to be talking about one of the best named books in the world. And this book is called Sadie. And it is like, come on. It is by Courtney Summers. And similar to Virginia, what you said is, just because it's written by a Canadian author does not mean that it actually takes place in Canada. So unfortunately, this book does not provide that sense of place. It does not provide that connection with people that you can actually meet. But I still think it is a wonderful book, and it is still written by a Canadian author, so it still fits the category. So I actually first read this book because of the name. I have to admit, I was drawn to it as a child who grew up with very little named after her. I could never find the license plates. I could never find the keychains. Nothing had my name. It was very exciting to find a book that had my name. There are a few now. So that was what originally drew me to this book, and I am so glad that it did. This book received a very rare 5-star review from me on my Goodreads account, and I think that it is an excellent, excellent book. It follows the story of a murdered girl and a sister who won't give up until she gets justice and revenge for her sister's murder. So it follows Sadie, and Sadie is a 19-year-old who lives in the small town of Cold Creek, Colorado, and she lives with her sister Maddie. Now, even before their mother left them, Sadie had raised Maddie and will do pretty much anything for her sister. But then Maddie is found dead, murdered. After no murderer is found during the investigation, Sadie decides to leave Cold Creek and go in search of the man who she believes killed her sister. That is one side of the story, but this book actually has two sides of the story. So the other side comes 8 months after Maddie's murder, 8 months after Sadie has left in search of Maddie's killer. And this side of the story follows West McCrae. And West is a radio personality from New York City. And he is contacted by Sadie and Maddie's neighbor and surrogate grandmother, May Beth Foster. And she contacts West after Sadie's car is found. The car is abandoned. Sadie is nowhere to be seen. Nobody knows what happens to her. So West comes to Cold Creek, Colorado, and he starts to follow Sadie's trail. And he starts to unravel the clues that Sadie was in pursuit of. Now, the interesting part about West's story is that it is actually told through a podcast. And the podcast is called The Girls. And on this podcast, West conducts interviews with those who Sadie came across during her investigation. He talks to the people in Cold Creek who knew Sadie and Maddie, and everything that he learns is put onto this podcast. The story is told kind of as a back and forth between Sadie's and West's perspective. So you get to see what Sadie was experiencing on her journey, as well as West following those same clues and what he is now finding about the path that Sadie took. It reads very much like a true crime story in my mind. I had to continuously kind of remind myself that this wasn't a real story. It is sad. It is kind of a devastating story, but it's also filled with suspense and mystery. It would probably have fit into the tearjerker category, to be honest with you, but it also would fit into thrillers, as well as Canadian authors. Yeah, so I would definitely recommend it. It's a wonderful book. If you want more into the story, if you get really into it and you want to learn more about the story, the podcast The Girls was actually created as a podcast, as kind of a follow-up to the book. And so you can also listen to the podcast as well as read the book. So yeah, definitely recommend. Great name, but also a very powerful story, a very intriguing characters, and really, really well done.
Thanks, Sadie.
You're welcome.
I'm not a big thriller person myself, but it does sound pretty good. If you're just joining us now, we are talking about Canadian authors today. And I guess I'm up. So I feel bad because I feel like I started on this thing of like, you know, what I really like about Canadian is the place, that sense of place, and like, oh, I've been there. But what I actually chose has nothing to do with Canada as a place. So I know. Sorry, Karine. All right. So I chose the comic book Women World by Aminder Dhaliwal. And this actually started out as an Instagram comic. So each page kind of works on its own as just a funny little comic, but it also comes together as a bigger story. And the deal is there was a birth defect that ends up wiping out all men on the planet. And it's in a future where the environment has been decimated and only women are left. But women kind of come together to survive in this new world. It sounds super serious, but it's not at all. It's really, really silly and hilarious. Dhaliwal actually said that she wrote it kind of to make feminism more approachable. But I also found it to be very inclusive. There's lots of characters from different backgrounds, and it has trans characters, which I really appreciate. It doesn't gloss over that as like, all the men are dead. And not really, you know, not really giving any thought about our categories of men and women. So that was something that really made me appreciate it, even though it's just this sort of like funny gag comic in some ways. It really had a lot of thought that went into it. So the women create like a more collaborative government, and they do things like make a flag that has Beyonce's thighs on it. And, you know, like that's their emblem. My favorite ones are the ones that follow this young girl and her grandma. And her grandma's kind of the only person who really like lived a whole life when men were still around and still remembers them. So the kid is always coming to her grandma being like what was it like? What were men like? And she's really like obsessed with it. And I printed off my favorite page. So the grandma's thinking, the last generation was artificially born and all female. They'll never know men. Grandma, I found an artifact. Is that what men were like? And then it's a copy of a Paul Blart Mall Cop DVD. And so the little girl gets really obsessed and like thinks that all men were just like Paul Blart. Like that's just what men were. So it's just, I don't know. I think about that sometimes when I'm just like lying in bed, and it makes me laugh every time. There's all sorts of other great gags in it, and yeah, it's written by Aminder Dhaliwal, and she is from Brampton, Ontario. It's also a comic, so you can use it for your graphic novel land if you like. I guess it's technically science fiction, or like, I guess, speculative fiction, but not really. And the author is currently working on another webcomic called Cyclopedia Exotica about basically in our world, but there are also cyclopses, and sort of exploring the discrimination that cyclopses face. Also very funny and very thought-provoking. She's definitely an author that I'm gonna continue to follow because I really like her sense of humor. And I like the art, the way it's just very much like, you know, drawn a piece at a time. And that's okay, because it is this thing that everybody's experiencing on Instagram before she puts it into a full book. So definitely, if you want to laugh, check it out. It's not heavy read at all. It's a lot of fun. All right. So I think we've all had a chance to speak about a Canadian book. Does anybody have any clothing thoughts? Anybody's opinion of Canadian authors changed at all throughout this talk?
I guess it's like nice to see that kind of when I was going to high school, the idea of CanLit was very much like prairie angst. Like there's two sisters, one of them is beautiful, one of them is ugly. And they both live in a shack where it's winter all the time, and a strange man knocks on the door and what follows after. So it's really nice to see CanLit taking on like a diversity of voices, different genres, doing them well. And I think that what you said at the beginning, Fiona, about like finding these kind of amazing small presses in Canada that are doing such interesting works of kind of bringing more voices, more stories out, that CanLit is very exciting right now.
Awesome. We have this on recording, so.
It's going to come back and haunt you, Corinne. She's going to use that sound clip every time.
Can't go back now. Can't go back.
And if you're watching now or later, feel free to drop us a comment. Let us know what Canadian authors you love. We also have a Facebook group for our Spaceopoly. So I know there was a good discussion recently. I should have brought that into it, of some Canadian authors. There, yeah, go have a look. There's some good suggestions from patrons as well. With that, I think we are ready to move on to our next topic of the day. So we are going to be talking about Indigenous authors. So I did want to flesh that out a little bit. So Indigenous or First People in Canada include First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit people. Of course, there are Indigenous people literally all over the world. You might know Maori in New Zealand, Indigenous Australians, Sami in Northern Europe, or any of the many, 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 many other Indigenous groups all over the world. But Indigenous identity is not limited to authors with a status card. The best way to find out if an author is Indigenous is to see how they identify. So I like to make sure that I always read the bio before I read the book. And for me personally, I see reading Indigenous as a decolonizing act. Whether it's about intergenerational trauma, speculative futures, colonization, resilience, family, or just everyday joy, books by Indigenous authors bring perspectives that are not part of many of our lived experience, and it can't be found anywhere else. Historically, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices have not always been given the space in the publishing industry, and their stories have been told by other people. So I think taking the time to read books by Indigenous authors puts their story back in their hands, and it's really important. This is a topic that I know we were, I think, universally pretty excited to talk about, all of us, so we can agree on that, which is exciting. And we are going to start with Liz's book.
Great, thanks, Fiona. And that was really well said. So thank you for acknowledging that, and such a great introduction to, yes, a topic that we're all very excited to talk about today, which are Indigenous authors. And so for my pick today, I chose a book by an author that may already be well known to a lot of you, and that is Starlight by Richard Wagamese. So admittedly, I'd never read any Richard Wagamese prior to this, but the beautiful cover did draw me in, and also the wonderful reviews. Sadly, this was the last book published by Richard Wagamese. It was actually published posthumously, and he did not have the opportunity to finish the book prior to his death. But fear not, fortunately, his editor was able to craft a somewhat of a denouement to the end of the book, which, although it's bittersweet because you feel like it was such a beautiful, at least I felt like it was such a beautiful book. I did feel as though the editor did do justice in taking Wagamese's voice, who they were very familiar with, and wrapping things up, as well as providing a beautiful tribute at the end to the author. So this book, for those of you who are familiar with Wagamese's works, it can be considered sort of the book that comes after in a chronology to Medicine Walk. So the primary character of this book, his name is Frank Starlight. If you have read Medicine Walk, then you'll recognize that name, because in that book, Frank was a 16-year-old boy who had returned home to his father. And so in this book, in Starlight, Frank is an older man now who has inherited his father's farm, and he lives a very quiet and dignified life in his small community. So not only is he a man of the earth in terms of farming and ranching, and also working with his hands, but he is also very in tune with the world, the natural world around him. And one of the ways he likes to unwind is to commune with nature at night. And in his area, this book takes place in northern BC, he likes to go into the woods at night with his camera and look out for wolves. So he'll go running through the woods in search of these beautiful creatures that he enjoys taking photographs of. Now, although Frank lives a very quiet and unassuming life and mostly keeps to himself, into town come a woman named Emmy and her very young daughter. Now, these two happen to be on the run from Emmy's abusive ex. They did not part on good terms. And so now she is doing whatever she can to ensure that her and her daughter are safe. So they end up in this small town in which Frank lives, and she's hoping to shelter Emmy there. Now, because they ran away and are on the run, they don't have a lot of resources available to them. And unfortunately, in this small town where they stick out because everybody knows one another, they get caught shoplifting so that the two have something to eat. That's why they went to the store and tried to smuggle out some food. So Emmy is at risk of losing her daughter, unfortunately. And this is where Frank happens to step in. So he decides to take in Emmy and her daughter so that they have a safe place to live. And over time, the two earn each other's trust and get to come to an understanding about each other. And what develops is a really understated but beautiful story about human relationships, and also how the world around us can influence our behaviors, our character, and also our relationships with each other. It was an incredibly beautifully written book. I wouldn't call it sparse, but I found Wagamizi's style to not have a lot of embellishment, which I really appreciate. So it was bittersweet to remind myself that sadly this was Wagamizi's last work. However, I do really look forward to going into the backlist for Richard Wagamizi and catching up on all the other wonderful books that I've missed.
That's great. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, he was quite prolific, right? Like, yes, he has quite a few books. All right, Corinne, you are up.
I'm up next, and I feel like I'm on a bit of like a nonfiction kick. And again, using my strategy, if I want to explain something, I go to children's books first and then kind of go out from there. And so a book that came out, I feel like last year, is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People. So this is an adaptation of the original text by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who has been working with the National Indigenous Movement for about 4 decades. And it was adapted by 2 very distinguished writers, Dr. Debbie Reese, who is tribally enrolled at Nambe Pueblo. She is also the author of the American Indians in Children's Literature blog, which is kind of required reading for anyone who is interested in children's literature and the depiction of First Nations people. And Jen Mendoza, who is a curriculum specialist and who married into a Creek family. So they took the original text, which was meant for adults. It's part of a series called Revisioning History. So it takes what is the narrative of American history and examines it from different, often marginalized points of view. And what I really, really liked about this book is that it really challenges that fairy tale that we share with the United States, that the settling or colonization was this kind of easy, foretold process, that the land was empty, that it was easy to walk into. And what I think this book does a really good job of is kind of showing how massive the civilization was in North America, how massive and accomplished and varied and different and interconnected, and in order to settle it, how history has had to kind of spin that to make it okay for settlers to take the land from them. So it's part of like the systematic dehumanization and erasure of the history there, so that you're able to kind of perpetuate that myth. And so what I think this book does a really good job of is kind of challenging all the narratives about the history of the United States, and as well as the history of Canada, because it uses much as the same strategies. It's kind of written almost like a little like a textbook, like how you would approach a history of Canada or a history of the United States, but instead it's looking at the history of Indigenous people in the United States. So what I really like is that it'll give you kind of a section of history, and then it'll give you questions afterwards to think about, or to challenge your thinking about certain things and why you think that they are the way that they are. So in addition to talking about things like Columbus, why is Columbus important? Why is it okay to celebrate someone like this? They take on different things like sports teams with racist names. Why is that okay? And really get you thinking about things in a way that if you are from a settler heritage, haven't really had to consider that perspective. So I love that it is a history. So it really does chronicle that whole history from pre-contact up to Standing Rock. So it traces that line of resiliency, that line of strong leadership, of people constantly fighting against that narrative and fighting against white supremacy. And it takes it all the way up to kind of current day. And I love that it has those extra questions that really get you thinking and challenging your own widely held beliefs, because, you know, the history that we have been taught often is a fairy tale that benefits a very certain group of people. And so books like this are so important to challenge us and to see what really happened beneath the surface and why. So I really encourage, if you're looking for a great book for middle schoolers or for high schoolers to start looking at Indigenous history, this is a good one to start with.
Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, sounds like a really important book. So if you are just coming in, we are talking about Indigenous authors today, and feel free to leave us some suggestions for Indigenous authors that you enjoy, or let us know if you've read some of these books. Like you were saying, Corinne, with sort of the focus on resilience, I find that's something that I really like about Indigenous literature. Is I feel that's often a focus, and while there's always discussions of very difficult topics, it's really these books are proof of resilience. So the book that I chose was A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. Oh, sorry, you've got a little bit of reflection there. And Alicia Elliott is a Tuscarora writer who moved to Six Nations Grand River Reserve when she was 13. And this book is a collection of autobiographical essays on trauma, colonial legacies, identity, and family. And I actually listened to the audiobook version, which is narrated by the author. And I would definitely recommend it because it was very powerful to have her essays come from her own voice. And it's definitely a book that I want to read again, like maybe listen to it again and then read it again and then buy it so that it's there and I can look things up every time I think about it. I just don't feel like I was able to absorb the complexity of it the first time. And I actually find it's a very difficult book to talk about, to find the right words, because it's just, it was amazing, but not necessarily in like a way where I can say specifically, this is what she talked about, because she talked about so much. So in the first essay, the title essay, she talks about her young teen years, living on the res in a 2-bedroom trailer with a family of 7. She explores the mental illness that her mother went through and her own dehumanizing experience with therapy. Throughout the book, she really centers the conflict in her life created by having a Haudenosaunee father and a white Catholic mother, and how in herself, with that mixed heritage, she became both the oppressor and the oppressed. She talks about before having her first child, while she was pregnant, she, has this moment of wishing that her child has blue eyes and light skin so that they'll have an easier life. Well, at the same time in her life, she's also trying to reclaim her language, her Tuscarora language, and her culture, and just that her life is constantly filled with these contradictions, these things that don't seem to fit together. But she doesn't tiptoe around the fact that that is a cause of colonialism. And I really appreciate that she doesn't internalize that blame, that she's able to call that out. And I think it's a really powerful part of the book, part of the essays. The book is really resilient and beautiful. And although it's not the meaning of the title of the book, I really felt like I was observing a mind spread out on the ground. She really lets you into her thoughts fully and doesn't back away when those thoughts are conflicting or confusing. And like, she's just such an amazing, beautiful writer. I don't have the words to recreate like how she writes, but I definitely encourage you even to, I think some of her essays are available online, like even to like just check out one of her essays and see if you enjoy her writing style, because it was a big turning point for me in my reading of just recognizing how much I appreciate authors who let you into their mind in that way. Yeah, so I enjoyed it a lot, and I really recommend it. It could also fit into our category of autobiography or biography, and of course Canadian authors. All right, so I think Virginia is going to talk next. I'm very excited to hear about this book.
I'm glad you are excited. This actually thanks to Liz. Liz recommended this book, thinking that maybe I would enjoy it. Because as Fiona pointed out earlier, we want to hear, like, publishing industry is just getting better at it, but not very good. Still as publishing like own voices book. And one of the things, like, as you can tell, I love speculative fiction. So fantasy, science fiction, horror is my thing. And it's hard to find books by Indigenous author. There's very, very few out there. And I sort of try to read as much as I can to see which one, I would like to recommend. And I couldn't find one that I really enjoyed, just because there's so few, and so Liz recommended this book to me. Good choice, thank you, Liz. This is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wagishi Rice, and Wagishi Rice is a CBC host actually. He does the Up North show in Northern Ontario, and he sort of lives in Sudbury, Ontario, and also he spends time in the Waksaksing First Nation. So this is where the book is set. And so this is a dystopian novel, and just a word of warning, some of the things that you might be reading in this book might be kind of similar to just what happens about 4 months ago. So just, if you're not into reading that at this point, maybe save it for later. It is a really, really good book. So we first, the book opens with Evan, who is getting ready for winter. He, like many people in his community, has the conveniences, the modern conveniences of, going to a grocery store, getting food, cell phones, TV, all of that. But he also remembers sort of the weight, of the Anishinaabe people, where you try to be self-sufficient, right? So in the winter, before winter comes, you want to make sure that you have enough food, make sure you have enough for not just your own family, but also people in your community. And that's what he was doing. He was out there hunting, and he just got a moose. And so he was like packing things up, and going home. And when he got home, he realized that it's eerily quiet. And so he's like, oh, that's weird. All right, the TV is off. Why is the TV off? The TV is always on. And Nicole, his partner, came out and said, oh yeah, we're having a satellite signal for like the whole day, and which is not unusual, especially in the winter season. There's a snowstorm going out there. And so they kind of figure, oh yeah, it's just the usual, like it'll come back tomorrow. They woke up the next day. They notice the clock is off, the fridge is not on, like there's no electricity. Again, not super unusual. The power is out. That happens to them quite frequently during the winter. So they're not too concerned at this point. But as days go by, they realize the phone is dead, There's no way to find out what's happening. They can't contact Hydro. They don't know what's going on, and people are getting a little antsy about it. When Evan, for example, went to the grocery store, he realized that everything is being cleaned out. Like he has like a couple cans that he could find, and that's it. People have been like stocking up, especially people who are not as ready, for the winter, like him and his family. So there's just people are panicking about what's going on. And then the council was kind of thinking, well, how do we make sure that everybody is taken care of? So they're talking about like, well, maybe we should start up the generator, making sure the food that we all got is not spoiled. And they, it runs on diesel. Give everybody conserve. Everybody like, try to save power. It should be able to last until about February, and there's deliveries coming. Next week is coming, but again, looking at that snowstorm, I don't know whether they'll be able to get here. So the community is busy trying to prepare themselves, and then they got 2 visitors. They are youths that have gone to Gibson in a nearby town to go to college, and when they arrived, they were in tears. They were so glad they're back home. And they told them that it's not just here, but everywhere else there is a complete blackout and there's chaos out there. And they were in school, they were told to stay put, but they realized that this is not, like, we need to find our way home. And so they stole 2 snowmobiles and barely made it out after doing something quite horrible to get out, and so they finally made it the way home, and they were just so glad to be home. So now they know it's not just them. They're going to have a long winter ahead of time, and they have to kind of figure out how to prepare themselves. And of course, as they are planning, they have another visitor, and this time it's not one of them, it's an outsider, and this outsider is going to bring the chaos to them. This is, as I said, a dystopian novel, so a lot of bleak, a lot of horrible, a lot of dire things happen in this book. However, I do have to say, as a reader, I don't feel hopeless. Like, there was a warmth that surrounds this book. I think it's because of the community and Evan's family. It is just such a loving, functional family, which is very different, from a lot of the dystopian novel that I read. It's always like people trying to and people did end up having to do horrible things to survive. But the family, the central family, and the Waksaksing First Nations, you can tell how that they're self-sufficient. Their way of life is going to be they're going to be okay, even despite how bleak the world is outside them. And I feel that's kind of a refreshing thing to read in a dystopian novel. Is not just all hopelessness, and you don't get all depressed afterwards. So I really enjoyed that part of the book, and also the way the author sort of weaves into all the different lifestyles and the different way of life of the Anishinaabe people. Like, it really does kind of make you as an outsider kind of learn about sort of how the Waksaksing First Nation work, what they do, and you feel very much a part of the community and he brings you in, and he weaves in those details very seamlessly. It's never didactic, it's never forced. It just kind of flows within the story. And I found out when I was after I read this book, I was looking online, and there is actually going to be a second book to this, and he has signed a book deal. He hasn't written it yet, but it's going to come out in 2022. So I'm looking forward to that. So again, this is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wapgishik Rice. Oh, Fiona's gone.
Fiona's gone. I mean,
I know she was so excited to hear about that book, though.
Yeah,
it's not my genre. You make it sound good.
Yeah.
You make it sound good.
No, that's the thing. I know it's probably not your genre, but like I said, you just feel so warm. You feel protected by them. Like you don't feel like, oh no, everything is just horrible is gonna happen. Like, it is horrible, but yet you feel so warm by the story, by the family, by the community. So it's quite different. It's not just all cutthroat and dark.
It's not the road. It's not the road.
no, it's not the road. Definitely not the road. So yeah. So I think it's for a dystopian novel is very, very hopeful. So
Cool.
yeah.
All right. Looks like we've got one more left. Sadie.
Okay.
Take us
So
away.
I'm actually going to also talk about a dystopian novel, which is not usually my genre. It is not the kind of book that I tend to kind of move towards, but I am going to talk about The Marrow Thieves. And this is by Métis author Cherie Demeline. And Cherie is from the Georgian Bay Métis community in Ontario. And I just want to start off actually with a quote from Cherie, kind of looking at the difference between what she would like to be identified as and recognized as a writer. So she says, "I would love to be recognized as a writer of Indigenous stories. I'm not a Canadian writer. This is what is now known as Canada. It means something different to and for me." So that quote was actually quite powerful to me, to kind of hear that she is an Indigenous writer. She's not a Canadian writer. But The Marrow Thieves, it does take place in what is now known as Canada, and it actually takes place in a future world, and it is set in a dystopian future. And in this future, the world that we know has been destroyed, and it's been destroyed by pollution, it's been destroyed by global warming, climate change, coastal cities have crumbled into the ocean, natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes, they've destroyed communities. And as an effect of all of these horrific events and the trauma that people have gone through, most people have lost the ability to dream. Now, the exception to this is the Indigenous peoples of North America, and they continue to dream, and they carry the ability to dream in the marrow of their bones. Now, because of this ability, the Indigenous peoples are hunted to extract the marrow of their bones and have it turned into a serum that that those who do not have this ability, mainly white people, can use to gain the ability to dream back. So that's sort of the premise of the world, the premise of the story. Definitely seems a very dark world, a world that I think is very easy to imagine. And I say that I recognize how hard that might be for some people to hear, but I think that it is a world that, looking at the way our world is now, it is easy to see how we could get to this world. So the story begins with two brothers, Francis, or Frenchie, and Mitch. Their parents have been lost to what are called schools. Now, these schools are where people are taken to have their bone marrow extracted. And these schools are very strongly based on the residential schools. They have taken that idea and they have brought it back and turned it into these centers where they take Indigenous people to extract their bone marrow from them. So they've lost both of their parents to these schools, and they are now on their own. So they are hiding in a treehouse, and Mitch has just found a bag of Doritos, and they're both very excited about this. But when they open the bag of Doritos and start eating it, they are discovered by a group of recruiters. Recruiters are the people who go around searching for Indigenous peoples and taking them to the schools. So in order to save his younger brother's life, Mitch sacrifices himself, allowing Frenchie to get away. We now shoot ahead about 5 years later. Frenchie is 15 years old. Frenchie is a Métis boy. He has now lost his whole family to the schools. So after his brother is taken, Frenchie is taken in by a group who are hiding and traveling north. It is said that the north is safer. It is said that the Indigenous communities in the north have found a way to survive and have recreated the communities that were lost in other parts of the country. So the group is led by an Anishinaabe man named Miigwans, and this group kind of becomes Frenchie's found family on this journey. So as the story goes on, him and his family continue to journey north. You learn about each of the people in the group. You learn their coming to story, which is sort of how they found their way to this group. what their path was, what their journey was to find the group together. Now, as I mentioned, I don't tend to read a lot of dystopian fiction, but I found that similar to what Virginia was saying, well, on the surface, this was a very dystopian story. It was a story of survival. The majority of it really focuses on the characters, the family, the relationships that they have with each other, the history that they have as well. It focuses on the lost languages of the Indigenous people and how they are trying to find their community again, how they're trying to rebuild that language, how they're trying to rebuild the stories and the histories that have now been lost. And it's similar to what Virginia said. It is actually, I found, an uplifting story. It was definitely a tearjerker. I'm finding, Corrine, that I might be closer to you, where I do tend to cry at more books than I thought that I did. But for different reasons, I think. So it was not super sad. The ending does kind of uplift you, which is wonderful. The characters are so strong. There's kind of playfulness to it. Frenchie, there's a young woman, Rose, who comes into their group who Frenchie has a crush on. So you kind of experience that teenage crush and a bit of romance as well, and kind of navigating that whole thing. But it was a very powerful book. It was a very interesting and compelling book, and I would recommend it 100%.
Fantastic. And a Canada Reads book, if I remember.
It is, yes. Yeah, 2018 Canada Reads selection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has anyone read because they just have an adult novel, right? Same author, I think. Was it?
By Cherie.
Yeah,
Dudley?
I think it just came out. Yeah, I was curious whether anybody has read it.
There was one, though. I was just looking
I
at
what
it.
it's called, but yeah.
Anyways, we can all do some Googling and put this in the comments.
I was just curious whether anybody has read it, because I know many of you have read The Marrow Thief, so I was curious. So.
Empire of Wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I have not. This was the first Cherie Demeline book that I'd read. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Well, Fiona had to leave us as a host, but I think we would like to thank Fiona for hosting us.
Mm-hmm.
And
her enthusiasm for Canadian literature is
yes.
It's infectious.
Yes, it sure is.
Yes. So thank you to Fiona for hosting these two great topics. I love the comment by PoMo Eva Reads, who has some fantastic other suggestions if you're interested in reading more Canadian or more Indigenous authors. We'll also be posting the book list of all the books from the Port Moody Library that you can put holds on, ebooks and physical books that you can come and pick up at the library, as we are now open for browsing and curbside. And if you haven't picked up your Spaceopoly game board, you can pick it up at the library or from our website, print it off, and you can even make your own little dice.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah. Any parting words from anyone?
Next week?
Next week. What are we doing next week?
Next week we have book 1 in a series, and also books about social issues.
Ooh. Okay, I'm excited for that one. I think I'm hosting it. So I will get excited about it. If I'm not already.
You're one will get yourself more excited about it.
I will. But thank you on behalf of everyone for this little book chat for the Summer Reading Club. We would like to thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching, and enjoy your reading.
Woo!
Bye.
Bye.